Maimonides, whose authority and whose knowledge of the sacred history can hardly be rejected, says, "Whoever shall find out the true sense of the book of Genesis ought to take care not to divulge it. If a person should discover the true meaning of it by himself or by the aid of another, then he ought to be silent. Or if he speaks of it, he ought to speak of it but obscurely and in an enigmatical manner. This confession that what is written in the Holy Writ is but an allegory was made by other Jewish authorities besides Maimonides. For we find Josephus stating that Moses philosophized or spoke riddles in figurative allegory when writing the book of Genesis. Therefore, modern science, by neglecting to unriddle the true sense of the Bible and by allowing the whole of Christendom to go on believing in the dead letter of the Jewish theology, tacitly constitutes herself the confederate of the fanatical clergy. She has no right to ridicule the records of a people who never wrote them with the idea that they would receive such a strange interpretation at the hands of an inimical religion, that their holiest texts should be turned against them, and that the dead man's bones could have smothered the spirit of truth is the saddest feature of Christianity. The gods exist, says Epicurus, but they are not what the rabble suppose them to be. And yet Epicurus, judged as usual by superficial critics, is set down and paraded as a materialist. But neither the great first cause nor its emanation, human immortal spirit, have left themselves without a witness. Mesmerism and modern spiritualism are there to attest the great truths. For over 15 centuries, thanks to the blindly brutal persecutions of those great vandals of early Christian history, Constantine and Justinian, ancient wisdom slowly degenerated until it gradually sank into the deepest mire of monkish superstition and ignorance. The Pythagorean knowledge of things that are, the profound erudition of the Gnostics, the world and time-honored teachings of the great philosophers, all were rejected as doctrines of Antichrist and paganism and committed to the flames. With the last 7 wise men of the Orient, the remnant group of the Neoplatonists, Hermias, Priscianus, Diogenes, Eulalius, Damascius, Simplicius, and Isidorus, who fled from the fanatical persecutions of Justinian to Persia, the reign of wisdom closed. The books of Thoth, or Hermes Trismegistus, which contain within their sacred pages the spiritual and physical history of the creation and progress of our world, were left to mold in oblivion and contempt for ages. They found no interpreters in Christian Europe. The Philalethians, or wise lovers of truth, were no more. They were replaced by the light fleers, the tonsured and hooded monks of papal Rome who dread truth in whatever shape and from whatever quarter it appears, if it but clashes in the least with their dogmas. The whole endless catalogue of bad spirits are not devils in the sense of the Christian clergy wants us to understand, but merely spiritually incarnated sins, crimes, and human thoughts, if we may so express it. The devil, in his various transformations, can be but a fallacy. When we imagine that we see and hear and feel him, it is but too often the reflection of our own wicked, depraved, and polluted soul that we see, hear, and feel. Like attracts like, they say. Thus, according to the mood in which our astral form oozes out during the hours of sleep, according to our thoughts, pursuits, and daily occupations, all of which are fairly impressed upon the plastic capsule called the human soul, the latter attracts around itself spiritual beings congenial to itself. Hence some dreams and visions that are pure and beautiful, others fiendish and beastly. The person awakes and either hastens to the confessional or laughs in callous indifference at the thought. In the first case, he is promised final salvation, at the cost of some indulgences which he has to purchase from the church, and perhaps a little taste of purgatory or even of hell. What matter? Is he not safe to be eternal and immortal, do what he may? It is the devil. Away with him with bell, book, and holy sprinkler. But the devil comes back, and often the true believer is forced to disbelieve in God, when he clearly perceives that the devil has the best of his creator and master. Then he is left to the second emergency. He remains indifferent and gives himself up entirely to the devil. He dies, and the reader has learned the sequel in the preceding chapters. Let the student of occult sciences make his own nature as pure and his thoughts as elevated as those of these Indian seers, and he may sleep unmolested by vampire incubus or succubus. Around the insensible form of such a sleeper, the immortal spirit sheds a power divine that protects it from evil approaches, as though it were a crystal wall. There are persons whose minds would be incapable of appreciating the intellectual grandeur of the ancients. Even in physical science were they to receive the most complete demonstration of their profound learning and achievements. Notwithstanding the lesson of caution which more than one unexpected discovery has taught them, they still pursue their old plan of denying, and what is still worse, of ridiculing that which they have no means of either proving or disproving. So, for instance, they will pooh-pooh the idea of talismans having any efficacy one way or the other, that the 7 spirits of the apocalypse have direct relation to the 7 occult powers in nature appears incomprehensible and absurd to their feeble intellects, and the bare thought of a magician claiming to work wonders through certain Kabbalistic rites convulses them with laughter. Perceiving only a geometrical figure traced upon a paper, a bit of metal or other substance, they cannot imagine how any reasonable being should ascribe to either any occult potency. But those who have taken the pains to inform themselves know that the ancients achieved as great discoveries in psychology as in physics, and that their explorations left few secrets to be discovered. Apply a piece of iron to a magnet, and it becomes imbued with its subtle principle and capable of imparting it to other iron in its turn. It neither weighs more nor appears different from what it was before, and yet one of the most subtle potencies of nature has entered into its substance. A talisman in itself, perhaps worthless bit of metal, a scrap of paper, or shred of any fabric, has nevertheless been imbued by the influence of that greatest of all magnets, the human will, with a potency for good or ill, just as recognizable and as real in its effects as the subtle property which the iron acquired by contact with the physical magnet. Let the bloodhound snuff an article of clothing that has been worn by the fugitive, and he will track him through swamp and forest to his hiding place. Give one of Professor Buchanan's psychometers a manuscript, no matter how old, and he will describe to you the character of the writer, and perhaps even his personal appearance. Hand a clairvoyant a lock of hair or some article that has been in contact with the person of whom it is desired to know something, and she will come into sympathy with him, so intimate that she may trace him through his whole life. Breeders tell us that young animals should not be herded with old ones, and intelligent physicians forbid parents to have young children occupy their own beds. When David was old and feeble, his vital forces were recruited by having a young person brought in close contact with him so that he could absorb her strength. The late Empress of Russia, the sister of the present German Emperor, was so feeble the last years of her life that she was seriously advised by her physicians to keep in her bed at night a robust and healthy young peasant girl. Whoever has read the description given by Dr. Kerner of the Seeress of Prevorst, Madame Huff must well remember her words. She repeatedly stated that she supported life merely on the atmosphere of the people surrounding her and their magnetic emanations, which were quickened in an extraordinary way by her presence. The seeress was very plainly a magnetic vampire, who absorbed by drawing to herself the life of those who were strong enough to spare her their vitality in the shape of volatilized blood. Dr. Kerner remarks that these persons were all more or less affected by this forcible loss. With these familiar illustrations of the possibility of a subtle fluid communicated from one individual to another, or to substances which he touches, it becomes less difficult to understand that by a determined concentration of the will, an otherwise inert object may become imbued with protective or destructive power according to the purpose directing. A magnetic emanation unconsciously produced is sure to be overpowered by any stronger one with which it may come into opposition. But when an intelligent and powerful will directs the blind force and concentrates it upon a given spot, the weaker emanation will often master the stronger. A human will has the same effect on the akasa. The mandrakes, dudum or love fruit, found in the field by Reuben, Jacob's son, which excited the fancy of Rachel, was the Kabbalistic mandragora, notwithstanding denial, and the verses which refer to it belong to the crudest passages in their esoteric meaning of the whole work. The mandrake is a plant having the rudimentary shape of a human creature with a head, 2 arms, and 2 legs forming roots. The superstition that when pulled out of the ground it cries with a human voice is not utterly baseless. It does produce a kind of squeaking sound on account of the resinous substance of its root. which it is rather difficult to extract, and it has more than one hidden property in it, perfectly unknown to the botanist. Says Professor Joseph LeConte, what is the nature of the difference between the living organism and the dead organism? We can detect none, physical or chemical. All the physical and chemical forces withdrawn from the common fund of nature and embodied in the living organism seem to be still embodied in the dead, until little by little it is returned by decomposition. Yet the difference is immense, is inconceivably great. What is the nature of this difference expressed in the formula of material science? What is that is gone, and whither is it gone? There is something here that science cannot yet understand, yet it is just this loss which takes place in death, and before decomposition, which is in the highest sense vital force. Let human-born erroneous dogmas and theological sophistry contradict each other. Let one crowd off the other, and the subtle casuistry of one creed fell to the ground the crafty reasoning of another one. Truth remains one, and there is not a religion, whether Christian or heathen, that is not firmly built upon the rock of ages, God and immortal spirit. In India, spiritual seances are not held in the dark, as in America, and no conditions but perfect silence and harmony are required. Neglected as psychology now is, and with the strangely chaotic state in which physiology is confessed to be, by its most fair students, certainly it is not very likely that our men of science will soon rediscover the lost knowledge of the ancients. In the days of old, when prophets were not treated as charlatans nor thaumaturgists as impostors, there were colleges instituted for teaching prophecy and occult sciences in general. Samuel is recorded as the chief of such an institution at Ramah. Elisha also at Jericho. The schools of Hazim, prophets or seers, were celebrated throughout the country. Hillel had a regular academy, and Socrates is well known to have sent away several of his disciples to study manticism. The study of magic or wisdom included every branch of science, the metaphysical as well as the physical, psychology and physiology, in their common and occult phases, and the study of alchemy was universal, for it was both a physical and a spiritual science. Therefore, why doubt or wonder that the ancients, who studied nature under its double aspect, achieved discoveries which, to our modern physicists, who study but the dead letter, are a closed book? Mediumship may be either first self-developed, second by extraneous influences, or third may remain latent throughout life. The reader must bear in mind the definition of the term, for unless this is clearly understood, confusion will be inevitable. Mediumship of this kind may be either active or passive, repellent or receptive, positive or negative. Mediumship is measured by the quality of the aura with which the individual is surrounded. This may be dense, cloudy, noisome, mephitic, nauseating to the pure spirit, and attract only those foul beings who delight in it, as the eel does in turbid waters, or may be pure, crystalline, limpid, opalescent as the morning dew. All depends upon the moral character of the medium. About such men as Apollonius, Iamblichus, Plotinus, and Porphyry, there gathered this heavenly nimbus. It was evolved by the power of their own souls in close unison with their spirits, by the superhuman morality and sanctity of their lives, and aided by frequent interior, ecstatic contemplation. Such holy men pure spiritual influences could approach, radiating around an atmosphere of divine beneficence. They caused evil spirits to flee before them. Not only is it not possible for such to exist in their aura, but they cannot even remain in that of obsessed persons, if the thaumaturgist exercises his will or even approaches them. This is mediatorship, not mediumship. Such persons are temples in which dwells the spirit of the living God, but if the temple is defiled by the admission of an evil passion, thought, or desire, the mediator falls into the sphere of sorcery. The door is opened, the pure spirits retire, and the evil ones rush in. This is still mediatorship, evil as it is. The sorcerer, like the pure magician, forms his own aura and subjects to his will congenial inferior spirits. Plotinus, when asked to attend public worship of the gods, is said to have proudly answered, "It is for them, the spirits, to come to me." Iron is only magnetized temporarily, but steel permanently, by contact with the lodestone. Now steel is but iron which has passed through a carbonizing process, and yet That process has quite changed the nature of the metal so far as its relations to the lodestone are concerned. In like manner, it may be said that the medium is but an ordinary person who is magnetized by influx from the astral light. And as the permanence of the magnetic property in the metal is measured by its more or less steel-like character, so may we not say that the intensity and permanency of mediumistic power is in proportion to the saturation of the medium with the magnetic or astral force. One thing is certain: when a man shall have discovered the perpetual motion, he will be able to understand by analogy all the secrets of nature, progress in direct ratio with resistance. The Hermetic axiom maintains that only the first cause and its direct emanations, our spirits, scintillas from the eternal central sun, which will be reabsorbed by it at the end of time, are incorruptible and eternal. But in possession of a knowledge of occult natural forces, yet undiscovered by the materialists, they asserted that both physical life and mechanical motion could be prolonged indefinitely. Elie de Beaumont has recently reasserted the old doctrine of Hermes that there is a terrestrial circulation comparable to that of the blood of man. Now, since it is a doctrine as old as time that nature is continually renewing her wasted energies by absorption from the source of energy, why should the child differ from the parent? Why may not man, by discovering the source and nature of this recuperative energy, extract from the earth herself the juice or quintessence with which to replenish his own forces? This may have been the great secret of the alchemists. Stop the circulation of the terrestrial fluids and we have stagnation, putrefaction, death. Stop the circulation of the fluids in man and stagnation, absorption, calcification from old age, and death ensue. If the alchemists had simply discovered some chemical compound capable of keeping the channels of our circulation unclogged, would not all the rest easily follow? Alchemy is as old as tradition itself. The first authentic record on this subject, says William Godwin, is an edict of Diocletian about 300 years after Christ, ordering a diligent search to be made in Egypt for all the ancient books which treated of the art of making gold and silver, that they might be consigned to the flames. This edict necessarily presumes a certain antiquity to the pursuit, and fabulous history has recorded Solomon, Pythagoras, and Hermes among its distinguished votaries. The secret, say the alchemists, as if enjoying the ignorance of the uninitiated, is an amalgamation of the salt, sulfur, and mercury combined 3 times in azoth by a triple sublimation and a triple fixation. Attach thyself, says the alchemist, to the 4 letters of the tetragram disposed in the following manner. The letters of the ineffable name are there, although thou mayest not discern them at first. The incommunicable axiom is cabalistically contained therein, and this is what is called the magnetic arcanum by the masters. The arcanum, the 4th emanation of the Akasa, the principle of life, which is represented in its 3rd transmutation by the fiery sun, the eye of the world, or of Osiris, as the Egyptians termed it, an eye tenderly watching its youngest daughter, wife, and sister. Isis, our mother Earth. See what Hermes, the thrice great master, says of her. Her father is the sun, her mother is the moon. It attracts and caresses and then repulses her by a projectile power. It is for the Hermetic student to watch its motions, to catch its subtle currents, to guide and direct them with the help of the Athanor, the Archimedean lever of the alchemist. What is this mysterious Athanor? Can the physicist tell us, he who sees and examines it daily? Aye, he sees, but does he comprehend the secret ciphered characters traced by the divine finger on every seashell in the ocean's deep, on every leaf that trembles in the breeze, in the bright star whose stellar lines are in his sight, but so many more or less luminous lines of hydrogen? God geometrizes, says Plato. The laws of nature are the thoughts of God, exclaimed Ørsted 2,000 years later. His thoughts are immutable, repeated the solitary student of Hermetic lore. Therefore, it is in the perfect harmony and equilibrium of all things that we must seek the truth. And thus, proceeding from the indivisible unity, he found emanating from it 2 contrary forces, each acting through the other and producing equilibrium. And the 3 were but one, the Pythagorean eternal monad. The primordial point is a circle. The circle squaring itself from the four cardinal points becomes a quaternary, the perfect square, having at each of its four angles a letter of the mirific name, the sacred tetragram. It is the four Buddhas who came and have passed away, the Pythagorean tetractys, absorbed and resolved by the one eternal no being. Tradition declares that on the dead body of Hermes at Hebron was found by an Assyrian initiate the tablet known as the Smaragdine. It contains in a few sentences the essence of the Hermetic wisdom. To those who read but with their bodily eyes, the precepts will suggest nothing new or extraordinary, for it merely begins by saying that it speaks not fictitious things, but that which is true and most certain. What is below is like that which is above, and what is above is similar to that which is below, to accomplish the wonders of one thing. As all things were produced by the mediation of one being, so all things were produced from this one by adaptation. Its father is the sun, its mother is the moon. It is the cause of all perfection throughout the whole earth. Its power is perfect if it is changed into earth. Separate the earth from the fire and subtle from the gross, acting prudently and with judgment. Ascend with the greatest sagacity from the earth to heaven, and then descend again to earth, and unite together the power of things inferior and superior. Thus you will possess the light of the whole world, and all obscurity will fly away from you. This thing has more fortitude than fortitude itself, because it will overcome every subtle thing and penetrate every solid thing. By it the world was formed. This mysterious thing is the universal magical agent, the astral light, which in the correlations of its forces furnishes the alkahest, the philosopher's stone, and the elixir of life. Hermetic philosophy names it Azoth, the soul of the world, the celestial virgin, the great magnes, etc., etc. Physical science knows it as heat, light, electricity, and magnetism, but ignoring its spiritual properties and the occult potency contained in ether, rejects everything it ignores. It explains and depicts the crystalline forms of the snowflakes, their modifications of an hexagonal prism, which shoot out an infinity of delicate needles. It has studied them so perfectly that it is even calculated with the most wondrous mathematical precision that all these needles diverge from each other at an angle of 60 degrees. Can it tell us as well the cause of this endless variety, the most exquisite forms, each of which is a most perfect geometrical figure in itself? These frozen star-like and flower-like blossoms may be, for all materialistic science knows, a shower of messages snowed by spiritual hands from the worlds above for spiritual eyes below to read. The philosophical cross, the two lines running in opposite directions, the horizontal and the perpendicular, the height and breadth which the geometrizing deity divides at the intersecting point, and which forms the magical as well as the scientific quaternary, when it is inscribed within the perfect square, is the basis of the occultist. Within its mystical precinct lies the master key, which opens the door of every science, physical as well as spiritual. It symbolizes our human existence, for the circle of life circumscribes the 4 points of the cross, which represent in succession birth, life, death, and immortality. Everything in this world is a trinity, completed by the quaternary, and every element is divisible on this same principle. Physiology can divide man ad infinitum, as physical science has divided the 4 primal and principal elements and several dozens of others. She will not succeed in changing either. Birth, life, and death will ever be a trinity, completed only at the cyclic end. Even were science to change the longed-for immortality into annihilation, it still will ever be a quaternary, for God geometrizes. The whole of the present work is a protest against such a loose way of judging the ancients. To be thoroughly competent to criticize their ideas and assure oneself whether their ideas were distinct and appropriate to the facts, one must have sifted these ideas to the very bottom. It is idle to repeat that which we have frequently said and that which every scholar ought to know, namely, that the quintessence of their knowledge was in the hands of the priests, who never wrote them, and in those of the initiates, who, like Plato, did not dare write them. Therefore, those few speculations on the material and spiritual universes which they did put in writing could not enable posterity to judge them rightly, even had not the early Christian Vandals, the later Crusaders, and the fanatics of the Middle Ages destroyed 3 parts of that which remained of the Alexandrian library and its later schools. Professor Draper shows that the Cardinal Ximenes alone delivered to the flames in the squares of Granada 80,000 Arabic manuscripts, many of them translations of classical authors. In the Vatican libraries, whole passages in the most rare and precious treatises of the ancients were found erased and blotted out for the sake of interlining them with absurd psalmodies. Who then of those who turn away from the secret doctrine as being unphilosophical and therefore unworthy of a scientific thought has a right to say that he studied the ancients, that he is aware of all that they knew, and knowing now far more, knows also that they knew little, if anything? This secret doctrine contains the alpha and omega of universal science. Therein lies the corner, the keystone of all the ancient and modern knowledge. And alone in this unphilosophical doctrine remains buried the absolute in the philosophy of the dark problems of life and death. The great energies of nature are known to us only by their effects, says Paley. Paraphrasing this sentence, we will say that the great achievements of the days of old are known to posterity only by their effects. If one takes a book on alchemy and sees in its speculations on gold and light by the brothers of the Rosy Cross, he will find himself certainly startled for the simple reason that he will not understand them at all. The Hermetic gold, he may read, is the outflow of the sunbeam or of light suffused invisibly and magically into the body of the world. Light is sublimated gold, rescued magically by invisible stellar attraction out of material depths. Gold is thus the deposit of light, which of itself generates. Light in the celestial world is subtle, vaporous, magically exalted gold, or spirit of flame. Gold draws inferior natures in the metals, and intensifying and multiplying converts into itself. Let everyone ponder over the wise words of Professor Roscoe in his lecture on spectrum analysis. The infant truths must be made useful. Neither you nor I can see the how or the when, but that the time may come at any moment when the most obscure of nature's secrets shall at once be employed for the benefit of mankind. No one knows anything of science can for one instant doubt. Who could have foretold that the discovery that a dead frog's legs jump when they are touched by 2 different metals should have led in a few short years to the discovery of the electric telegraph? Great discoveries usually come with a flash, and not by induction. There are many more flashes in store for us. Silver and green were associated together as far back as the days of Hermes. Luna, or Astarte, the Hermetic silver, is one of the 2 chief symbols of the Rosicrucians. It is a Hermetic axiom that the cause of the splendor and variety of colors lies deep in the affinities of nature, and that there is a singular and mysterious alliance between color and sound. The Kabbalists place their middle nature in direct relation with the moon, and the green ray occupies the center point between the others, being placed in the middle of the spectrum. The Egyptian priests chanted the 7 vowels as a hymn addressed to Serapis. And at the sound of the 7th vowel, as at the 7th ray of the rising sun, the statue of Memnon responded. Recent discoveries have proved the wonderful properties of the blue-violet light, the 7th ray of the prismatic spectrum, the most powerfully chemical of all, which corresponds with the highest note in the musical scale. The Rosicrucian theory that the whole universe is a musical instrument is the Pythagorean doctrine of the music of the spheres. Sounds and colors are all spiritual numerals, as the 7 prismatic rays proceed from one spot in heaven. So the 7 powers of nature, each of them a number, are the 7 radiations of the unity, the central spiritual sun. Future experimenters will reap the honor of demonstrating that musical tones have a wonderful effect upon the growth of vegetation. The Eastern Ethiopians, the mighty builders, had come from India as a matured people, bringing their civilization with them. Herodotus did not tell all, although he knew that the real purpose of the pyramid was very different from that which he assigns to it. The father of history confesses more than once that Greece owes everything to Egypt. Diodorus, in his work on the Egyptians, says that Isis has deserved immortality, for all nations of the earth bear witness to the power of this goddess to cure diseases by her influence. This is proved, he says, not by fable as among the Greeks, but by authentic facts. Galen records several remedial means which were preserved in the healing wards of the temples. He mentions also a universal medicine, which in his time was called Isis. The doctrines of several Greek philosophers who had been instructed in Egypt demonstrates their profound learning. Orpheus, who according to Artapanus was a disciple of Moses, Pythagoras, Herodotus, and Plato owe their philosophy to the same temples in which the wise Solon was instructed by the priests. Anticleides relates, says Pliny, that the letters were invented in Egypt by a person whose name was Menon, 15 years before Pheronius, the most ancient king of Greece. Jablonski proves that the heliocentric system, as well as the earth's sphericity, were known by the priests of Egypt from immemorial ages. This theory, he adds, Pythagoras took from the Egyptians, who had it from the Brahmins of India. Fenelon, the illustrious Archbishop of Cambrai, in his Lives of the Ancient Philosophers, credits Pythagoras with this knowledge and says that besides teaching his disciples that as the earth was round, there were antipodes, since it was inhabited everywhere, and says that besides teaching his disciples that as the earth was round, there were antipodes, since as it was inhabited everywhere, the great mathematician was the first to discover that the morning and evening star was the same. If we now consider that Pythagoras lived in about the 16th Olympiad, over 700 years BC, and taught this fact at such an early period, we must believe that it was known by others before him. The works of Aristotle, Laertius, and several others in which Pythagoras is mentioned demonstrate that he had learned from the Egyptians about the obliquity of the ecliptic, the starry composition of the Milky Way, and the borrowed light of the moon. If Chaldea, Assyria, and Babylon presented stupendous and venerable antiquities reaching far back into the night of time, Persia was not without her wonders of a later date. The pillared halls of Persepolis were filled with miracles of art, carvings, sculptures, enamels, alabaster libraries, obelisks, sphinxes, colossal bowls. Ecbatana in Media, the cool summer retreat of the Persian kings, was defended by 7 encircling walls of hewn and polished blocks, the interior ones in succession of increasing height and of different colors in astrological accordance with 7 planets. The palace was roofed with silver tiles, its beams were plated with gold. At midnight in its halls the sun was rivaled by many a row of naphtha cressets. A paradise, that luxury of the monarchs of the East, was planted in the midst of the city. The Persian Empire was once truly the garden of the world. In Babylon, there still remained its walls, once more than 60 miles in compass, and after the ravages of 3 centuries and 3 conquerors, still more than 80 feet in height, there were still the ruins of the temple of the cloud-encompassed Bel. On its top was planted the observatory wherein the weird Chaldean astronomers had held nocturnal communion with the stars. Still there were vestiges of the 2 palaces with their hanging gardens, in which were trees growing in mid-air, and the wreck of the hydraulic machinery that had supplied them from the river. Into the artificial lake with its vast apparatus of aqueducts and sluices, the melted snows of the Armenian mountains found their way, and were confined in their course through the city by the embankments of the Euphrates. Most wonderful of all, perhaps, was the tunnel under the riverbed. The thought of the present-day commentator and critic as to the ancient learning is limited to and runs round the exoterism of the temples. His insight is either unwilling or unable to penetrate into the solemn Advaita of old, where the Hierophant instructed the neophyte to regard the public worship in its true light. No ancient sage would have taught that man is the king of creation, and that the starry heaven and our mother earth were created for his sake. There was a vast difference between the true worship taught to those who showed themselves worthy and the state religions. The Magians are accused of all kinds of superstition, but this is what a Chaldean oracle says. The wide aerial flight of birds is not true. nor the dissections of the entrails of victims. They are all mere toys. The basis of mercenary fraud. Flee from these if you would open the sacred paradise of piety, where virtue, wisdom, and equity are assembled. Surely it is not those who warn people against mercenary fraud who can be accused of it. And if they accomplished acts which seem miraculous, who can with fairness presume to deny that it was done merely because they possessed a knowledge of natural philosophy and psychological science to a degree unknown to our schools? What did they not know? It is a well-demonstrated fact that the true meridian was correctly ascertained before the first pyramid was built. Herodotus gives us, in his account of Isis and the mysteries performed in her honor, an idea of the beauty and admirable softness of the linen worn by the priests. The latter wore shoes made of papyrus and garments of fine linen because this goddess first taught the use of it, and thus, besides being called Isiachi, or priests of Isis, they were also known as linigera, or the linen-wearing. This linen was spun and dyed in those brilliant and gorgeous colors, the secret of which is likewise now among the lost arts. Some suppose that these hardy navigators of Arctic and Antarctic waters have been the progenitors of the races which built the temples and palaces of Palenque and Uxmal, of Copan and Arica. Brasseur de Bourbourg gives us much more information about the manners and customs, architecture and arts, and especially of the magic and magicians of the ancient Mexicans. He tells us that Wotan, their fabulous hero and the greatest of their magicians, returning from a long voyage, visited King Solomon at the time of the building of the temple. This Wotan appears to be identical with the dreaded Quetzalcoatl, who appears in all the Mexican legends, and curiously enough, these legends bear a striking resemblance insomuch as they relate to the voyages and exploits of the Hittim, with the Hebrew Bible accounts of the Hivites, the descendants of Heth, son of Canaan. Solomon himself gives an account of this interview in his history, The Wonders of the Universe, the chief Wotan figuring under the allegory of the navigating serpent. The Laestrygonians, who devoured the companions of Ulysses, are traced to the huge cannibal race set in primitive days to inhabit the caves of Norway. In recognizing in the gods of Stonehenge the divinities of Delphos and Babylon, one need feel little surprised. Bel and the dragon, Apollo and Python, Osiris and Typhon are all one under many names and have traveled far and wide. The Bothal of Ireland points directly to its first parent, the Batilos of the Greeks and the Bethel of Canaan. When we discover an almost perfect identity between the character of Tsarevna Militrissa, with a moon in her forehead, who is in constant danger of being devoured by Zmei-Goranich, the serpent or dragon, who plays such a prominent part in all popular Russian tales, and similar characters in the Mexican legends, extending to the minutest details, we may well pause and ask ourselves whether there be not here more than a simple coincidence. It is possible that so far it may be a coincidence, as the identification of one with the other rests upon a poor argument, but it is known, adds de Bourbourg, that this prince, and according to others, his father Baal, received, like the Nin of the Zendalis, the homages of his subjects under the shape of a serpent. The latter assertion, besides being fantastic, is nowhere corroborated in the Babylonian records. It is very true that the Phoenicians represented the sun under the image of a dragon, but so did all the other people who symbolized their sun gods. Belus, the first king of the Assyrian dynasty, was, according to Castor and Eusebius, who quotes him, deified, i.e., he was ranked among the gods after his death only. Thus, neither himself nor his son, Ninus or Nin, could have received their subjects under the shape of a serpent, whatever the Zendalis did. But Bel, according to Christians, is Baal, and Baal is the devil, since the Bible prophets began so designating every deity of their neighbors. Therefore, Belus, Ninus, and the Mexican Nin are serpents and devils, and as the devil, or father of evil, is one under many forms. Therefore, under whatever name the serpent appears, it is the devil. Strange logic. Why not say that Ninus the Assyrian, represented as husband and victim of the ambitious Semiramis, was high priest as well as king of his country? that as much as he wore on his tiara the sacred emblems of the dragon and the sun. Moreover, as the priest generally assumed the name of his god, Ninus was said to receive his subject as the representative of this serpent god. The idea is preeminently Roman Catholic and amounts to very little, as all their inventions do. If Nunes de la Vega was so anxious to establish an affiliation between the Mexicans and the biblical sun and serpent worshippers, why did he not show another and better similarity between them without tracing in the Ninevites and the Zendalis the hoof and horn of the Christian devil? And to begin with, he might have pointed to the chronicles of Fuentes of the Kingdom of Guatemala and to the manuscript of Don Juan Torres, the grandson of the last king of the Quiche. This document, which is said to have been in the possession of the lieutenant general appointed by Pedro de Alvarado, states that the Toltecas themselves descended from the house of Israel, who were released by Moses and who, after crossing the Red Sea, fell into idolatry. The dying Jacob thus describes his sons. Dan, says he, shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path that biteth the horse heels, so that his rider shall fall backward. I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord. Of Simeon and Levi, the patriarch, or Israel, remarks that they are brethren, instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly. Now in the original, the words their secret read their sod, S-O-D. And Sod was the name for the great mysteries of Baal, Adonis, and Bacchus, who were all sun gods and had serpents for symbols. In the Persian Logos, the Honover, or the living manifested word of God, the Zoroastrian Enoch Verhi is identical with the Jewish I am, and the great spirit of the poor untutored Indian is the manifested Brahma of the Hindu philosopher. Okay, here the author is speaking of the Cambodian Angkor Wat complex. For our part, we may add that there are on the walls several repetitions of Dagon, the man-fish of the Babylonians, of the Kibarian gods of Samothrace. This may have escaped the notice of the few archaeologists who examined the place, but upon stricter inspection they will be found there, as well as the reputed father of the Kibari, Vulcan, with his bolts and implements, having near him a king with a scepter in his hand, which is the counterpart of that of Chironea, or the scepter of Agamemnon, so called, said to have been presented to him by the lame god of Lemnos. In another place we find Vulcan recognizable by his hammer and pincers, but under the shape of a monkey as usually represented by the Egyptians. I'll add that she refers to Angkor Wat here as Nagkan Wat. Now, if Nagkan Wat is essentially a Buddhist temple, how comes it to have on its walls bas-reliefs of completely an Assyrian character, and Kibarian gods which, though universally worshipped as the most ancient of the Asiatic mystery gods, had already been abandoned 200 years BC, and the Samothracian mysteries themselves completely altered? Whence the popular tradition concerning the Prince of Roma among the Cambodians, a personage mentioned by all the native historians who attribute to him the foundation of the temple. Is it not barely possible that even the Ramayana itself, the famous epic poem, is but the original of Homer's Iliad, as it was suggested some years ago? The beautiful Paris carrying off Helen looks very much like Ravana, king of the giants, eloping with Sita, Rama's wife. The Trojan War is a counterpart of the Ramayana War. Moreover, Herodotus assures us that the Trojan heroes and gods date in Greece only from the days of the Iliad. In such a case, even Hanuma, the monkey god, would be but Vulcan in disguise. The more so that the Cambodian tradition makes the founder of Angkor come from Roma, which they place at the western end of the world, and that the Hindu Roma also apportions the west to the descendants of Hanuma.